May I have your attention, please? Our last session today, session 4, is on major powers, engagement or disengagement. We are pleased to have Dr. Nong, Executive Director and Senior Fellow, Institute for China-America Studies, China. Mr. You have the floor.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon again. Welcome back to our fourth session. I think we all understand from the previous session that the South China Sea is no longer an issue between the claimants, not even no longer issues in the regional topics. So now we have more and more countries who have a lot of interest in this region. So in today's panel, we are honored to have 5 very distinguished fellows and researchers from different type of powers who's going to share with us their views on the their perception on the South China Sea from different role of major powers. So our first speaker is Dr. Patrick Cronin, and who is a senior advisor and director of Asia Pacific Security Program of American New Security Center based in Washington, D.C. And the floor is yours, please. I was told by the MC that I have to play a harsh role in keeping the time for 12 minutes so that everyone can have more time for discussion. Thank you.
Nong, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to be back in beautiful Da Nang. The first 3 panels of this conference all had South China Sea in the title. This is the first panel that does not have South China Sea in the title, and I intend to fully exploit that and try to fathom what the organizers meant by the title of this panel. Major power engagement or disengagement? Who could they be talking about? Well, let me interpret it my own way by saying that in my paper and in my brief presentation, I want to make 3 points. First, the United States is not retrenching from Asia in the world, it is recalibrating. And while I don't work for the US government, I'm in very close contact with a lot of the Asia team and other officials in the administration, and I know this as a fact. Secondly, while major power competition is surely intensifying, the competition is bounded. It should not, it probably will not lead to conflict, to war, hot or cold. And thirdly, America's positive agenda for Southeast Asia supports a rules-based order, sustainable economic growth, inclusive diplomacy, and security cooperation. So let me talk about these 3 points. The United States is not retreating into some fortress America, despite all of the pundits who write about this topic. And this is even more so after the midterm election this week, where the Democrats in the House of Representatives, working with Republicans, will make sure that the United States preserves its strong role around the world. The United States is focused on strengthening its economic and military foundations of power for a very good reason, because the Indo-Pacific, the Indo-Asia Pacific, is so very dynamic. It's driving the globe. So if the United States is not competing, if the United States is not seeking to remain competitive by maintaining strong economy and a strong military, then it's going to lose a lot of ground indeed. The principal objective of making America more competitive, vis-a-vis major powers in particular, is found in the Trump administration's national security strategy and other documents that express a concern that some powers are changing the rule set, modifying the rule set through incremental, ambiguous, and unilateral actions. And the challenge to preserving the post-war order requires a United States that's no longer the preponderant power to find new ways to renew U.S. diplomatic, economic, and military competitiveness. And that's what the Trump administration is trying to do. Indeed, as President Trump said in this city last November, the United States has been an active partner in this region since we first won independence ourselves, and we will be friends, partners, and allies for a long time to come. And America's abiding interest in Asia is reinforced by the direction of its economic growth and its defense spending. The economy of the United States is approaching its 10th consecutive year of expansion with a world-leading GDP of $20 trillion. The nearly $700 billion the United States is allocating to military operations this year represents the most significant single increase in defense spending since 2001. And there's an acute awareness on both sides of the political aisle in Washington of the need for more effective diplomacy and development. Secretary of State Pompeo is a forceful advocate for diplomacy, and Congress recently passed the BUILD Act, which overhauls the way the U.S. finances foreign assistance and creates a new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation with $60 billion in financing authority. Meanwhile, Congress is on the cusp of passing a bipartisan bill designed to strengthen U.S. engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. The Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, ARIA, would authorize $1.5 billion in new funding over the next 5 years for regional diplomacy, development, and security. Other new development and investment initiatives are set for unveiling later this month at the ASEAN and APEC gatherings. In short, rumors of America's disengagement from the region miss the mark. So let me turn to my second point about major power relations and especially U.S.-China competition. The U.S. administration is striving to work with other major powers when our interests and values intersect. The United States has robust relations with Europe. I wish they were even better than they are. It's expanding regional cooperation with India and Japan. The U.S. wants fair, open, and cooperative ties with China and Russia. But competition is here a reality. And while the Trump administration would like to turn some of that competition toward greater cooperation, it will not shy away from meeting challenges directly. The U.S. sees competition as a necessary, if delayed, reaction to creeping assertions of sovereignty, enacted in some cases in the form of so-called hybrid warfare and gray zone operations. Notwithstanding competition, the Trump administration rejects the idea of a Thucydides trap and the notion of an inevitable conflict between a rising power and a status quo power. Leaders have agency, and it is up to them to determine the future course of relations. Washington seeks to develop areas of cooperation with China and Russia, especially when it comes to complex global issues such as transnational terrorism, piracy and illicit trafficking, and humanitarian assistance and natural disaster. And of course, Washington could do more. I wish it would, especially regarding climate change and resilience to climate change, the preservation of oceans and our maritime commons, dare I mention the word plastics, and the global environment broadly speaking. But cooperation is likely to receive less attention than the thornier issues of competition. China and America have become each other's pacing threat, the standard against which each country measures its defense, economic, and diplomatic power. But U.S. policy is not aimed at the containment of China. It's not crafted to restrain the peaceful rise of China. Instead, U.S. policy is designed to provide effective responses to assertive policies that seek unilateral change to the status quo, or exploit international rules, or interfere in the domestic politics of others. Even the recent hard-hitting speech by Vice President Mike Pence, and you'll note the timing of the speech was deliberately a month in advance of his arrival in Asia, because he wanted to have the hard edge of policy back behind him and bring diplomacy and development forward when he's here this month. But he said that it was a tough love message for China. America's reaching out our hand to China, and we hope that soon Beijing will reach back with deeds, not just words. So the United States wants a constructive relationship with China, perhaps not unlike the one outlined last month by America's cornerstone ally in the region, Japan. Even so, China is the foremost potential challenge to a favorable balance of power, existing rules, and smaller regional states that could be subject to coercion and even force on the one hand, or imprudent inducements on the other. The competition with China, though, is bounded. While the two nuclear powers have no interest in starting a war, the United States has belatedly awakened to how Beijing is waging a competition with all instruments of power. And this is something that's not going to change with the midterm election this week. The Democrats and the Republicans in the Congress and the leadership in the executive branch are like-minded when it comes to standing up to challenges to the rule set and standing up for U.S. interests. But the fear that major power confrontation may play out in Southeast Asia and spill over into war in the South China Sea is greatly exaggerated. And that's really my main point and why I wanted to go beyond the legal details of this conference to deliver that message. This is not going to happen. The United States is going to stand up for its interests and compete, but it's not going to create hostility. So turning to my third and final point, and by the way, I should add that this week, the United States and China are engaged in the so-called diplomatic and security dialogue, essentially a 2+2 of defense and foreign ministers meeting to talk about ways to have what Joe Nye has called cooperative rivalry. So my third and final point, highlighting key pillars of the U.S. strategy in Southeast Asia, I think there are four. It's a rules-based order, it's sustainable economic development, it's inclusive diplomacy, and it's security cooperation. The rule of law, well, this conference has delved into already so many brilliant details and important points about the rule of law. Stepping back from those details, though, the United States really is truly interested in the broad rule set, the broad freedom of navigation, the peaceful resolution of disputes, keeping countries independent and sovereign, free from coercion. While the rule of law requires far more than freedom of navigation operations, the United States has made it clear it will continue to play a leading role on behalf of the international community to maintain freedom of the seas by sailing, flying, and operating anywhere international law permits. And it's especially good to see additional contributions being made by so many different countries from the Indo-Asia Pacific and Europe and elsewhere, demonstrating their commitment to access to the global commons in the South China Sea and elsewhere. The second tenet of regional policy focuses on sustainable economic growth, fair trade, high standard development, done transparently in a manner that builds skills and capacity locally and does not unduly trap a nation in debt. There is nothing wrong with China's Belt and Road Initiative that sunshine and high standards of accountability cannot fix. Meanwhile, the United States is increasing and should go further to mobilize public and private security support for trade, investment, and development. I've already mentioned the BUILD Act, ARIA. I've hinted at further announcements later this month, and hopefully we'll see the United States working with a constellation of allies and partners to invest big in energy infrastructure, digital connectivity, and more. Similarly, when it comes to the blue economy on which we all depend, we need to be far more serious about protecting the marine environment, bolstering transparency and local expertise, cracking down and enforcing the law that currently is failing to stop so much illegal fishing, among other things. A third tenet of U.S. policy in Southeast Asia is inclusive diplomacy, including trust building and with competitors and allies and partners alike. ASEAN centrality deserves broad support for its unique convening authority. Certainly that is a major reason why the United States embraces its U.S.-ASEAN strategic partnership. The U.S. supports ASEAN having a loud, unified voice in support of our Indo-Asia Pacific engagement, in opposition to militarization in the South China Sea, and in favor of a strong, binding code of conduct. At the same time, ASEAN members are pragmatic and often engaged in cooperation on the bilateral level, trilateral level, and beyond the region to find effective responses to real challenges. And that's what it's really about. We're here to find pragmatic, effective solutions to problems. Finally, the United States will continue to support security cooperation centered on information sharing, capacity building, and interoperability. Bolstering the ability of nations to see better what is approaching or happening in their maritime front yards or backyards, so to speak, can create everything from disaster resilience to higher degrees of reassurance. Capacity building, especially around the basic Coast Guard and other law enforcement agencies, air defense, naval and air forces, will give nations a better ability to protect their sovereignty and EEZs. And through bilateral, minilateral, and larger multilateral exercises and training opportunities, nations will create a readiness for dealing with future contingencies. So again, security cooperation is part of a comprehensive diplomatic, economic, and military policy designed to preserve peace and stability, and with the reliable backing of U.S. power to help ensure major power stability, Southeast Asia will remain a fertile region for cooperation, and Da Nang will remain a thriving maritime economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cronin, and sharing with us and sending us very positive message that we're not vulnerable to new area of Cold War between China and the States, which is very important for this region. And then our second speaker is Dr. Christopher Roberts from University of Canberra, Australia. And to add to, he's director of the National Asian Studies Center at the Institute for Governance Policy Analysis in the university. The floor is yours. We can't wait to hear Australia's perspective.
Thank you very much. First, my thanks to the organisers for the privilege of being here, giving me the opportunity to present today. I am somewhat flattered as an Australian that my country has been included under the major power panel. But in terms of Australia's position on the South China Sea, I guess a lot of my focus is going to be on the last 5 years in particular. We do have several important interests in the South China Sea, including freedom of navigation. I have a question mark on commercial shipping because I don't see too many viable or probable scenarios where that is at risk. But there is the military aspect there, which I'll come to in a moment. Australia has also stated that it has a political or legal interest in the maintenance of a rules-based order based on the prevalence of international or adherence to international treaty-based law, and this is featured, as was mentioned earlier, by Hung in the 2016 Australian Defence White Paper. It was also featured specifically stated in our 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. Going back to the military domain, Australia has since 1980 been conducting Operation Gateway exercises, surveillance, across the South China Sea, and with developments in recent years, we saw the BBC intercept some challenge to one of those flights, and that is a concern. But we also have more broadly the five power defence arrangements, commitments, and naturally another key factor, but this is not an exhaustive list, is the Australia-US Alliance and our obligations under that as being something that weighs heavily on Canberra's mindset. Just at a very quick glance, the red sort of circles, etc., highlight areas of military interest and or activity and or disputes. The orange areas of influence, and there could be some overlap there, and some might be surprised to see Antarctica listed there. There's an ASPI report by Anne-Marie Brady, I think her name is, online that you can look at further there. This is my own analysis as a possible potential broader grand strategy. I just spent 5 months in Taiwan. It did help to give a new perspective being up there. But if we think in terms of international law and the dangerous precedents set by the South China Sea, what next if a similar set of developments occur in the East China Sea? Maybe if in securing or seeking to secure the periphery, the first island chain, second island chain, for example, linking to earlier analysis, the neutralisation of perhaps the US military presence in Korea as an additional possibility, and from there reunifying Taiwan by any means and then extending out. So you have the southern approaches, the northern approaches, and then moving eastward from Taiwan. But in terms of the more public Australian or government position, I think it was quite evident that from 2017 there's a much more public sense of strategic alarm concerning the legality or lack thereof, the proportionality, and the extent of coercion in the specific context of the South China Sea, but also on other issues such as East China Sea and also the Doklam border dispute between India and China, and to some extent Bhutan there. Other than the dangerous precedents I've sort of mentioned in the sort of strategic sense, it's also the non-compliance with the 2016 arbitral award is also a dangerous precedent for treaty-based law more generally. So if we can be exceptionalists in the case of UNCLOS, what next? The WTO or any other treaty out there? So I think that is something that links to the emphasis on the rules-based order. And in June 2017, last year, why Prime Minister Turnbull referred to China 13 times in his keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue and stated we must preserve the rules-based structure. This means cooperation, not unilateral actions to seize or create territory or militarise disputed areas. This means not winning through corruption, interference or coercion. I also happened to be fortunate enough to be a month later in New Delhi and see Julie Bishop, as then Foreign Minister, give her second New Delhi oration, and that was also a well-coordinated speech that flowed neatly from Prime Minister Turnbull's speech, and also called for a new era of cooperation between like-minded states. By this, what was clear was she meant those that are supportive of a rules-based order. And soon thereafter we see Australia's support in line with India, Japan and the United States for the to restart the quadrilateral security dialogue. As one of numerous examples that could be given in terms of tangible actions during 2017, there's a 6-vessel naval task group that spent some months travelling across East Asia and through the South China Sea. The Global Times actually reported that Australia was encircling China, a little bit like being characterised as a major power. That was perhaps a little hard to imagine that Australia had the capability to do that. Nonetheless, in terms of, and it's not naturally solely in response to the South China Sea. Australia has many interests across the Indo-Pacific, and there are many, as identified by the 2016 Australian Defence White Paper, there are many potential over-the-horizon challenges and risks. But nonetheless, given the challenges in the region, which do include the South China Sea and things like the East China Sea, we're in the process of a $195 billion defence procurement program. And some of the recent purchases are listed, and some of a few years ago as well. But Australia is now the 5th largest arms importer, and given a population of 24 or so million people and the moderate size of the economy, that says something there. Nonetheless, overall, I'd say this provides a limited deterrence value. And force projection capabilities. There has, in response to Australia's statements, for example, in support, Australia was one of the few countries to explicitly endorse the arbitral award and call for full compliance with the arbitral award. So there's been a number of statements made by both government and perhaps the more assertive ones have been through the state, somewhat state-controlled media such as the Global Times. I would say, however, at this point to date, the responses and reactions to Australia have been relatively restrained. So simple things like postponements of ministerial meetings, etc. There's been reports by winemakers of delays at customs of their export of wine into China, but nothing of a real tangible, significant nature to affect Australia in a tangible negative sense. So aside from the South China Sea, the military concerns and the broader context of the relationship, there remains quite an active debate, both between academics and also between political parties and within political parties, about what Australia's approach should be, what a China policy, so to speak, should be. More tangibly, however, there's also been a lot of analysis about possible actual influence and or interference in Australian affairs domestically. This has been seen through the annual publicly available ASIO reports that at least highlight, without naming a specific country, some of the issues there, but stated, for example, last year that the scale of threat to Australia is unprecedented. The head of ASIO said that there are now more operatives, intelligence operatives in Australia than at the height of the Cold War. The economic relationship, as I've already touched on, is of course a very significant factor that has influenced and informed Australia's policy with China, and also the ebbs and flows in the level of assertiveness or the position or level of engagement that Australia has undertaken with regard to the South China Sea. For example, in 2017, China absorbed 30% of our total exports, that's in both goods and services. Interestingly, there's a 22.8% decline in investments by Beijing in Australia between 2016 and 2017, as but one sector where there is very significant reliance. That's our tertiary education sector. In 2017, 166,000 Chinese students studying at the tertiary level, 43, and this represents 43.3% of all international students. And just at a glance, this gives you an idea of, even though these figures are somewhat older, but if you look down at the left-hand corner there, you can see a very large reliance on our exports in minerals, raw materials, iron ore, coal, natural gas. I would highlight that that's a two-way interdependence, so if there was any economic repercussions, etc., I think sometimes the risk assessments are overinflated, perhaps back in Canberra, because it would distort the market so much that the prices would escalate through other suppliers, and any economic repercussions would be a two-way street should there be an escalation in tensions over, say, the South China Sea. So that was 2017 in terms of Malcolm Turnbull's statements, the quadrilateral security dialogue, etc. But then in 2018 we see quite a distinct shift. Maybe disengagement is too strong a word, perhaps a limited sense of disengagement. It was evident in my meetings with various officials in government agencies that there seemed to be a loss of confidence in the potential of the quadrilateral security dialogue. Some talked about perhaps the emphasis for academics such as myself should be on minilaterals and maybe the linking of minilaterals. There was also an enthusiasm, which is a good thing, about confidence in the capacity of ASEAN to complete a code of conduct, but often stated in the context of that naturally this will be on China's terms. But there was also a sense I felt in my discussions and meetings of a kind of South China Sea fatigue, and a feeling that it'd be nice just to sweep it, to use an ASEAN phrase, sweep this issue under the carpet for a couple of years and focus on economic and other matters. We also see early this year a very quick response to the 2018 US National Defence Strategy, both Prime Minister Turnbull and Foreign Minister Bishop making statements. FM Bishop, for example, said, "We don't see China posing a military threat to Australia. We continue to work closely with China." In contrast to the US, with its military exercises a few months ago where it disinvited China, Australia did not do the same, and in fact in September undertook 2 sets of military exercises, one bilateral, another one where China participated in multilateral exercises. And for the first time in over 3 years of discussions about freedom of navigation operations and US calls for Australia to also participate, in July 2018 for the first time Australia, through Foreign Minister Bishop, categorically ruled out any targeted phone ops by Australia against excessive claims in the South China Sea. So what might also explain this? I made the reference to a tale of 2 cities. I've talked a bit about Beijing. I think we can't dismiss the US factor and the Trump administration entirely either. For example, at the SLD last year, we have the statement by Prime Minister Turnbull that in this brave new world, we cannot rely on great powers to safeguard our interests. But there were incremental statements that were incrementally stronger as the months progressed. And by July 2018, we have what I would say would be the strongest criticism of US policies since the Gough Whitlam era in the early 1970s. And that was quoting here by Julie Bishop at the Chatham House keynote address in London, July 2018. Our closest ally and the world's most powerful nation is being seen as less predictable and less committed to the international order that it pioneered. The United States is now favouring a more disruptive, often unilateral foreign and trade policy that has heightened anxieties about its commitment to the rules-based order that it established, protected and guaranteed. And we have to remember that, for the past pretty much century, Australia has participated in every conflict the US has been involved in. Australia and the US are very close allies, so it's remarkable in the sense of the wording there. And she was interviewed on this, and it was stated that there was perhaps a need to send a more public signal to Washington to express concerns. But I think it would also be fair to say, based on my travels across the region, that to varying degrees, many elite and nations hold, or governments hold, similar concerns. And perhaps we also see, for similar reasons, a sense of unpredictability, but then other issues like being targeted by potential actual tariffs, a softening of the position of both Japan and India. In terms of confidence in the US, just at a glance, you can see here that Australia is in around the 20 to 34% range of confidence in the Trump administration. That was 2017. It's possibly would be lower now, and you can see the other countries listed. Where are we heading? Where are we at, and where are we heading? I think Australia is likely to continue with a rather cautious approach, which I think, given the interests that we share with many other countries in the region, is unfortunate. It's reinforced by a fractured political environment. In 2019, there's a strong possibility of a change of government with Labor coming in. There may be new policies, there may be some tweaking. I don't believe we'll see a significant strengthening of a comprehensive South China Sea policy. Whether, of course, there are limitations to what Australia can do as a middle power unilaterally. The key is a collective approach, and here I think it's not just Australia, but I think there are other issues with other countries as well, and the signs, the tea leaves are not reading in a way that would suggest that there's much probability of a strong collective approach to seek redress on breaches of international law and ensure the sovereign rights of nations across the region. There is the ASEAN Code of Conduct, but Professor Thayer, I'm sure, in his presentation will address some of the possible issues there. At a glance, though, if there was a collective approach, if you look at the military budgets just for some countries...
30 seconds, please.
Thank you. Just onto the final slide. You can see some benefits there. Now, in my caveats here, there could be a black swan event, change of the Trump administration, there could be a skirmish or some provocation that might galvanise. For example, the Red Emperor site in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. If Vietnam had not backed off there and there had been some issue or carry through with China's threat in the Spratly area, then that might have galvanised regional support on the international law in the South China Sea. And finally, these are more contentious. This is certainly not representing any position in Canberra, but in talking through the region, some steps for the purpose of thinking about the level of collaboration and action that would actually be necessary to make change, as opposed to what we normally talk about, and that is what is likely to be able to be done in the short or mid term. And unfortunately, if it's not enough, it's not going to work. We need to think what is actually necessary practically, as difficult as that might be to achieve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Robert Sen. Very comprehensive, covering a lot of experts. Now I would like to invite Professor Bonji Ohara, who is a Senior Fellow for International Peace and Security Department at Sasakawa Foundation of Japan, who is going to share with us. We have American perspective and Australia, now we have the third country of Quad, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm surprised you are still awake, even after the lunch. I expected all of us can have a good dream in this afternoon. I cannot provide such nice dream because I'm not such optimistic about Chinese behaviors in South China Sea. China has already controlled the Paracel Island from 1974, and after the Battle of the Sea with the Vietnam Navy. Also, Chinese Navy entered the Spratly Island from the 1988, and also had a battle with the Vietnam Navy and took the Johnson Reefs. And China also established the law of territorial water in 1992. And in the same year, the Chinese Navy built a territorial marker on the Govan Reef. After the effort of the ASEAN and Chinese diplomatic society, but Chinese Navy did not stop behaving as an aggressor. After the Chinese Prime Minister Zhu Rongji declared that China would solve the problem in the diplomatic way, but just after the Zhu Rongji's statement, China also seized the Mischief Reef in the early 1995. So I said I'm not such optimistic, so China will not stop behaving like this in the South China Sea. Because for China, not for us, the problem, issue in the South China Sea is not a problem between Southeastern countries and China. It is part of the major power game between United States and China. So the China has already built the more than around 3,000 meters runways and also hangars, buildings, oil storage facilities, water tanks, and radar facilities, and also anti-air missiles in shelters on the three artificial islands, Mischief Reef, Fiery Cross, and also the Sub Reef. So China, it shows China is very afraid of the military confrontation in South China Sea. But the target, rival, is the United States. China is afraid of that the U.S. will interfere the Chinese development with the every measures. So the measures include the military operation. So Chinese militarization of the artificial islands in South China Sea has the mainly 3 reasons. One is the strategic patrol by the SSBN. China has the some SSBN. Maybe they can operate only 2, but SLBN, they launched from the submarine, ballistic missile launched from the submarine, has only the 6,000 to 8,000 kilometers range. It means the Chinese Navy must make the strategic patrol by SSBN in the West Pacific Ocean. So China need to enter the Pacific Ocean without the contact by U.S. Navy. Once U.S. Navy contact the Chinese SSBN, then U.S. SSN will chase the Chinese SSBN always. So it cannot be the nuclear deterrence against United States. And submarine is the advantage of the survivability because of the secrecy of the, and they can keep the secret of its own position. So China need to keep the strategic patrol by the SSBN. And the second is the Chinese A2AD, also against the United States. And China is afraid of that the U.S. military operation around China mainland. And it also concerns the Taiwan issues. And the Taiwan issue is the very, severe problem to China. Because it is concerned with the legitimacy of the rule by Chinese Communist Party over the China mainland. So China is very afraid of that the U.S. Positive support to Taiwan, and also that Tsai Ing-wen administration has not accepted the 92 consensus. So China sent the training aircraft carrier Liaoning to make round-trip navigation around Taiwan from the end of December 2016 to the early January in 2017. And also the Chinese Air Force is conducting the round-trip flight around China by the long-range heavy bombers, H-6 and H-6K. And it also can carry the cruise missile with the 1,500 kilometers range. So H-6K also can target the U.S. bases on the Guam. So China is conducting military operation around Taiwan, and they conducted naval exercise in the northeast side of Taiwan and also the southeast, southwest side of Taiwan. So China need to militarize the South China Sea for denying the U.S. approach to the China mainland and also Taiwan. And the third one is the concern the Belt and Road. China is lean on the maritime transportation a lot. China import the more than 80% of oil from Middle East by the maritime transportation. So the China required Thailand to build the Kula Canal from the early 2000. And Xinhua is the party-run media in China. Also said the China is in danger if the United States choke the Malacca Strait. So the China has need to have the alternative transportation route without the Malacca Strait. But still, the maritime transportation is very important to China. Then China try to protect its own economic operations. So we can say it is defensive, but for China, but it is not for us. So we cannot accept the challenge by forces or try to change the status quo by forces. But Japan also has the Japanese own national interest, and without the Japanese national interest, the China has the now the combination of the offshore water defensive and also the open seas protection. It was declared in the Defense White Paper published in 2015. So China equipped the more than 40 corvette, which has the 1,300 tons to 1,400 tons, very small one. The Chinese Navy said it is good to the cost performance because number of ships is the advantage against the U.S. Navy in the operation. And China also conducted some level of the A2AD equipment. The China also developing the space as a military operation space. So China has already the 5 million square kilometers detective area in the South Pacific Ocean by the satellite. And it is for the ASBIM, anti-ship ballistic missiles. And it ranged the 1,500 kilometers to 2,000 kilometers by the Dongfang 21 Delta. And also they said they've already finished developing the DF-26, which has range of the 3,000 kilometers. And the next was the HXK heavy bombers with the cruise missiles, and also they will use the conventional submarine for the weight for the U.S. naval ships fleet. And then the last will be the Chinese surface ships. But on the other hand, China need to its safety navigation in the west side of China. It is concerned the maritime transportation and Belt and Road. But Japan cannot accept the part of Chinese behavior. But as you know, the Prime Minister Abe visited China in October. The Japanese business society always required Prime Minister Abe to improve the relations with China. But Prime Minister Abe carefully avoid using the word Belt and Road. And Japan wanted to show the cooperative behavior with United States. And JMSDF, I'm sorry, not JSMDF, JMSDF, Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. It is a navy in the wartime, but it is like a navy in the peacetime, as you know. The JMSDF conducted ASW exercise in South China Sea in September, just before the Prime Minister Abe visited China. At the time, Japan sent a real submarine to join the exercise. The exercise showed the Japanese capability of the anti-submarine warfare and also the imposed cost to China by the showing the presence of Japanese submarine. Japan does not have to send submarine always, but China need to take care of the Japanese submarines operation in this region. So, Prime Minister Abe also had a meeting with the Prime Minister Modi of India just after visit China. So, Japan is making balance, of course. Japan does not want to have a nightmare also. Nightmare means the severe military confrontation or war in the region. So we now considering the strengthening the allies of United States. Of course, the JapanUS Alliance is the first pillar of the three pillars of Japanese diplomacy. The first one is the strengthening of the JapanUS Alliance, and the second one is the enhancing the relations with neighboring countries, and the third one is the promoting economic diplomacy. So it is the one of the Japanese idea to it's already started strengthening the security cooperation with Australia and also other Philippines and other countries. So originally, we said hub and spoke, US-Japan Alliance as a hub and spoke, but we need to hub and spoke to be the network. But the network is not only for the alliance, and I think the Southeast Asian region must be the third actor, because no other actors can be the third actor next by the United States and China. And if the Southeast Asian region can be the third actor, economic actor, then we can change the structure or image of the US-China confrontation. And we also need to keep promoting the economic diplomacy with the Southeast Asian region countries and other regional countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ohara. Thank you for your presentation. Although I hear the word China more than Japan in your talk, and maybe during the Q&A, we'd like to hear more about Japan's interest and engaging with other claimants. Now I'm going to invite our next speaker, Dr. Felix Heiduk. He's a senior associate at the Asia Division, German Institute for International Security Affairs in Germany, based in Berlin. So I'd like to hear on you on European states.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Many thanks to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam for inviting me again to this lovely conference. I was given the task to discuss European powers and the South China Sea conflict. A caveat first, I speak here as an independent researcher. I am not in any position to speak for the German government or even for the EU for that matter. Now, if you closely look at the title the organizers provided me with, you'll see that the title states European powers and the South China Sea conflict, not in the South China Sea conflict, which basically suggests, and I'm not sure if this was intentional or not, seeing that we're bunched up with major powers, that Europe is not in the conflict, plays no part in it. And I felt no real need to adjust the title, because by and large I concur with such motion if one approaches the South China Sea conflict through the lens of hard military security, which Europe, I argue, with few exceptions, does by and large not. And my argument being that Europe's often seemingly tame engagement in the South China Sea conflict is set to continue for a number of reasons, which I will allude to in a few minutes. But let me start off with a brief rundown of recent debates and views in Europe on the South China Sea conflict. I would argue that the main prism through which the South China Sea conflict is viewed in Europe to this day is the prism of trade, commerce, and also economic security. a large share of merchandise imported by the EU is coming from East and Southeast Asia, and similarly, East and Southeast Asian states are major destinations for EU exports, and most of all of this trade is seaborne, in particularly shipped via the sea lanes running from the Straits of Malacca through the South China Sea to East Asia and Southeast Asia. So, in the European view, any disruption of the maritime trade with Asia is assumed to have a significant short and midterm negative impact on Europe's economic well-being, on its economic security. Second prism I would like to flag up is a more normative prism. The EU and its member states have declared an interest in preserving what is commonly referred to as the rules-based international order, and the EU and its member states have constantly reiterated general principles such as accordance with international law, in particular UNCLOS, peaceful dispute settlement, the promotion of a rules-based international system, principles of freedom of navigation, and so on. Now, the critique that I, being here in Southeast Asia quite a lot, that I often hear here in the region, but also in parts of Europe, is that the EU and its member states, despite their strong economic interests, do little more than issue principled statements on the South China Sea, don't really go beyond principled statements in their foreign policies towards the South China Sea. I think this is only partly correct, because in recent years in Europe, some have even called for an EU-Asia pivot, a European-Asia pivot, and some have strongly stressed the need for stronger diplomatic and military involvement by European powers and the EU in the South China Sea. Most notably, I would argue, France has taken a move beyond principled statements in recent years. The country's defense minister have publicly declared and followed up on it that Paris would send regular Navy patrols to the South China Sea to protect sea lines of communication, freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, and similar concerns have also voiced by Great Britain. So France and Great Britain, as two European powers, one of them will cease to be a European member state soon, but still be a European power, have sent Navy ships repeatedly over the last years to the South China Sea. And the French defense minister has even called for joint European patrols in the South China Sea. So there are some notable changes here, but nonetheless, I would argue that it has become clear that such a general recalibration of EU foreign policy towards the South China Sea is unlikely to materialize anytime soon. That France and Great Britain, seen through that way, will be the exception to the rule when you talk about European powers in the South China Sea. Because those in Europe actively seeking to play a military role in the South China Sea are few and far between. And I would argue there are three main reasons for this. First, the threat perception held in Europe differs markedly from those held by Asian states, but also from many other actors involved, such as Australia, Japan, the US, and others. Europe's main perceived security threats do not stem from Asia, do not involve the South China Sea, but stem from its immediate neighborhood. This pertains to the threat of militant Islamist groups such as ICAS, the so-called refugee crises, Brexit, not a security threat, but perceived as an internal potential threat to the unity of the European Union, and also to neighboring countries in the perception of at least some European member states, if not all, such as Russia. So China, on the other hand, as well as the South China Sea conflict, is not really perceived as an immediate security threat for the time being. Secondly, the dominant prism, as I've already alluded to, through which most European governments look at the South China Sea and the surrounding region, is the economic one. Trade, investments, commerce have so far taken priority over more hard military strategic considerations. And Europeans, for the time being, in my analyses, rarely link their economic interests and their foreign and security interests together to a more strategic approach, at least for the time being. And the third factor, I would argue, are the internal divisions inside the EU and a creeping so-called chinfluence, which have softened the stance of a number of EU member states towards China. Many Eastern and Southeastern European countries have been extending their relations with China in the hope of creating alternative sources for major investments and trade, and to balance against what they perceive as an increasingly austerity-laden, Germanocentric European Union. And this in turn has given China some political foothold in parts of Europe, which has become most visible in the aftermath of the PCA award. Prior to the award, there were calls for a clear and tough stance. However, a number of EU member states stopped the EU from issuing a statement that would have directly taken such a clear and tough stance in exchange for a statement that was generally considered to be weak and lackluster. So to conclude, overall, I would argue it seems safe to say that the EU and its member states continue to punch way beyond their economic weight when it comes to their engagement in Asia's maritime security theaters, especially the South China Sea. Unlike other external actors, with the exception of a comparatively small French and British Navy presence, the EU and its member states lack any significant hard naval power capabilities in the region. So talking about disengagement and engagement, I think disengagement, with the exception of a few EU member states in the hard military power projection sphere, is set to continue, with one exception though, which is often not talked about when we talk about the South China Sea conflict, and that's the fact that there are actually a lot of European frigates, submarines, radar systems, etc. operating in the South China Sea. They're just not manned by Europeans, because the one hard power dimension to which I think in which many European member states actually have a share in are European arms exports to the region, where this is often ignored. But if you just look at the 6 littoral states of the South China Sea, the volume of arms imports by these states from the EU, from the EU's member states, has grown rapidly in the last decade. More so, the majority of European member states' arms exports to the South China Sea concerns the naval sector. So there is a direct European involvement in the military upgrading in the region, which I think challenges to some extent the widespread view that the old continent basically plays no part in Southeast Asia's hard military security policy. This doesn't mean, however, that I would argue that there is no engagement by the EU and its member states in the South China Sea. Far from it. I think there is engagement beyond zero-sum logics, beyond the logic of spheres of influence, in the field of which is often referred to as non-traditional security. The EU and its member states have made repeated attempts, and I would argue will carry on to do so, to transfer their own ideas, their own experiences, their own best practices in conflict management, in the management of the seas, its resources, maritime protection, etc., via multilateral forums to partners in the region, especially the ASEAN member states. After all, the EU was founded to overcome zero-sum sphere logics and the thinking in spheres of influence to create a regional security community and offer stability in Europe in the aftermath of World War II. Moreover, I think the EU will continue to play a role as a staunch promoter of international law and of the international diplomacy in the settling of the disputes in the South China Sea. So maybe to counter Mr. Ohara, there is some sort of dream that I can present here. And it's not all and the debate of European engagement does not end necessarily with a disengagement from the hard military sphere of power politics. So to finish my presentation, I've got 18 seconds left before they take my German passport away, because punctuality is crucial. To finish my presentation, despite demands for a stronger engagement in the South China Sea from member states like France, but also from partners in Asia, I would argue in my paper that Europe's ambiguity between a rights-based approach promoted by Brussels and diverging individual member states' policy preferences, often driven by economic consideration, on the other hand, are set to continue for the foreseeable future. So I wouldn't argue that Europe plays no role in the South China Sea, but to give it major power status, I think, is flattering somewhat, but empirically, I would argue for the time being, not warranted, for good or bad. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Heiduk. I think you did a good job by adding to our knowledging on the major power possession from a European perspective. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to our last but certainly not the least speaker, Mr. Anton Tsvetov, project lead at the Center for Strategic Research for Russia, and who's going to share with us a very interesting view from a Russian perspective.
Thank you very much. To continue the European perspective, I'll be collecting your German passport after the session, but I will also try to keep myself limited, especially considering that I'm the last one, I think, holding us from an interesting discussion and then moving on to our formal dinner. And it is a great honor for me to be here, though I think that the fact that the last time a Russian speaker was on this conference was 3 years ago shows you how Russia is seen in the South China Sea conflict and its role is seen, and I hope that after my presentation you will see that maybe rightfully so, because I will start with a major spoiler and say that the South China Sea issue is not perceived, I think, as a major one for Russian foreign policy. I have to say that, well, I do not speak for the government as well. What I will try to do is convey my understanding of the foreign policy community's thinking that goes on in Moscow and try to explain why is it so. I think that the important part to start with would be to say that there are two distinct levels at which the South China Sea issue may be perceived as important for Russia. First is with regards to the global issues that are being decided, or the fate of which are decided in this conflict and in this issue. And the second is Russia's specific regional interests and with regards to its Asia policy. Now, and I think the distinction is very important precisely because for Russian foreign policy makers and for people thinking on Russian foreign policy, the South China Sea issue is first and foremost a political issue, not one of legal matters or competing claims. This may be a testament to the sort of realist views that Russian foreign policy thinkers tend to have, but it also has a lot to do with how the Russian leadership sees the evolving global order as one where the dominance of Western countries is diminishing allegedly, and there are new centers of power that are rising. Of course, this worldview favors Russia because in the official foreign policy narrative, Russia is a part of the emerging world, or at least re-emerging, not the declining part of the world. So this worldview favors Russia greatly. And this, of course, tells you of the sort of priorities that the Russian foreign policy community places here. And the most important, of course, issue is that the South China Sea issue for the Russian for a standard Russian foreign policy maker is first and foremost an issue of US-China competition and the quest for power. Now, we have to keep in mind that for a lot of foreign policy makers in Russia, a US-China, an exacerbation of the conflict between the United States and China is sort of inevitable. In this sense, most of the Russian leadership believe in the Thucydides trap, though they may not use this term. And at the same time, they believe that a similar fate is more or less likely for US-Russia relations. Now, where that brings us is that Russia-China alignment is something that is seen as natural and almost inevitable. You may see an example of this in how the US-China trade war and the European and American sanctions against Russia are seen. They are portrayed as phenomena of the same nature, which they may or may not be, but at least that is the way it is often seen. In this sense, I would like to say a couple of words about Russia's Asia policy and what it's aimed at. As I have argued before, and I think it is very important, a very important part of Russia's Asia policy and interest is in portraying a status of a global power. This also applies to Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, because in the Russian public perception and in the elite perceptions, a global power, a great power, is one that can influence outcomes in all parts of the world, especially in those parts where the fate of history or geopolitics is decided, and Southeast Asia is definitely a region like that. This is here where, for example, the Russia's relations with Vietnam come into play, because Vietnam has been a traditional ally for Russia in the times of when the world was simpler and divided into the Eastern and Western Bloc. And when Russia develops especially military relations with Vietnam, it reminds the population, it reminds the foreign policy elites of a time when the Soviet Union was a great power, and thus evokes a sort of continuity that Russia has the same sort of influence and power, or at least aspires to be the same as that Soviet Union used to have. I feel that I have to address, and throughout the day I've been asked several times about this, the whole situation in the Russia-China-Vietnam triangle, and the sort of the defense relations that Russia has with Vietnam, and as it is juxtaposed with the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Now, for Russian foreign policy makers, it is clear that for the next decade or so, the Russia-Vietnam military, technical, and arms trade relationship will be a given because of the inertia and because of the trust that has been built over the decades. And one could argue that for China, given the currently amazing relationship that we have with China, this is a very good arrangement, because it seems that Russia is providing Vietnam with the very capability that serves as a deterrent to any assertiveness that Vietnam could face on behalf of other claimants in the region. And Russia is the one who is supplying that capability. And it is much better for Russia to be supplying that capability than anyone else, because I mean there is an objective need in Vietnamese military strategy for such a capability. And the Russia-China relationship serves as a sort of safeguard and as a natural limitation for how far Russia-Vietnam relations may go. And this is one of the issues that I find very important for discussing Russia's policy in Southeast Asia and in South China Sea in particular, that for Russia, the South China Sea is not as important per se as it is with regards to its relationship to the relevant claimant states. Now, over the last, well, looking back 10 years, there wasn't much to discuss with regards to other countries than Vietnam, but in 2016, with President Duterte coming to power in the Philippines, there has been a certain budding relationship between Russia and the Philippines. It is in the very early stages of its development, and it is difficult for us to say whether it is something that has to do with the particular statements that President Duterte has made. Going forward, and as the organizer asked us to think about how the next 10 years or so may look like, I would like to address that issue in the last minutes of my talk and discuss what may be the risks for Russia's policy and for its more or less hands-off position. I think that one of the most important risks there is a risk that Russia and the United States may choose, any of the parties may choose to transfer the disputes and the problems they have regarding global issues, regarding their bilateral relationship, regarding the security issues in Europe, to other regions of the world. Now, that would mean that Russia and the United States consider their differences to be of a global nature, and that one party should oppose the other party's attempts to project power or increase influence wherever their interests interact or overlap. Now, one early example of such behavior could be if secondary sanctions under the CATSA Act that was adopted by the US Congress, if they start to be applied in Southeast Asia with regards to Russian state-owned companies operating here. And I'm not talking just about arms trade, because a lot of large energy companies are also under sanctions, and of course key technological exports companies are. And energy, arms trade, and technology exports are precisely what Russia's economic interest in the region is. Now, we have seen recent speculation about problems with transactions between Russia and Indonesia regarding fighter jets. We have seen speculations about issues arising in Russia supplying equipment for a thermal power plant in Vietnam because of the secondary sanctions. And that would be one indication that the problems that Russia and the United States have elsewhere are transported to Southeast Asia. Now, the last thing I would like to address is to say a couple of words about Russia's position on the South China Sea dispute. Now, it has been traditionally very neutral, or at least neutralist in its fashion. Russia has never supported any claimant in their claims to the South China Sea, and usually holds a very rounded out position. The only exception was President Putin's Hangzhou statement that Russia supports China non-adherence to the PCA ruling, and there was a special clarification made that does not regard the claims themselves, but only China's approach to non-adherence to the PCA ruling. But that has to do with similar case Russia is having in The Hague with Ukraine. And here again, my impression is that this position is neutral not because Russia regards the situation in the South China Sea as deserving a particular neutral position, but precisely because it wants to hold middle ground between China and Vietnam, and other claimants, of course, but China and Vietnam being the most important part. I have to say that the foreign policy community in Moscow broadly takes Russia's position in between China and Vietnam very seriously. And the neutral status and Russia's middle position is taken as something that has been traditional for Russian diplomacy. And it would be, I believe, a big change if these tensions we have with other countries could be translated and transported into the Southeast Asian region and into the South China Sea, and thus have as a consequence a change in Russia's legal behavior. Though I have to reiterate that that is highly unlikely from my point of view, because believe it or not, at least in Russian foreign policy ideology, all the international law issues are regarded as something that has been traditionally a strong point on behalf of Russian diplomacy, and as in a similar manner, at least rhetorically, Russia is always bent on supporting multilateralism, and I hope that we may see some new energy on behalf of Russian activity in multilateral organization in Asia next week when President Putin attends the East Asia Summit for the first time in his career. Thank you so much. I hope that was a useful overview.
Thank you, Anton. Very good presentation. And I would like to start by thanking all our very good panelists and for sharing with us very frankly on their different perceptions about major powers, either engagement or disengagement in this region. So before I open the floor to the floor, I think my jobs need to do a little summarize. I think I found a lot of common points when I listened to the 5 presentation. I think I hear the word security and peace in this region, and the other word I hear very commonly is China. And you're all talking about individual countries' perception about China in this region. And then I also hear a lot of divergence point of view, because when we talk about major powers and we look at their perception in a relationship, either with China or with other claimants in this region. So we hear a lot of different focus, like the US. I hear more about US-China's engagement in the journal US-China relations. And from Australia's point of view, I think you focus more on China, but I would like to hear also about how does Australia view, for instance, your interest or engagement with other claimants like Indonesia and other countries as well. And then for the Japan, and the same question, I was also very curious and interested to know about. I understand like Japan's interest in sea lane of communication in the South China Sea. I also understand that you are trying to help claimants stay in this region to build up the capacity by cooperation on training on Coast Guard and a lot of issues, and I'd like to hear about that as well. And for the European Union, I think you're making a very good point, because European countries, there are a lot of different countries like France and UK, which is no longer European Union states, and Germany, they all might have slightly different perception in interpreting the policy in the South China Sea. And Russia, and then because you're talking, I like your point by trying to compare the trilateral relation like China, Russia, US, and China, Vietnam, and China. So I think I have a lot of questions for you, but I'd like to keep it at the end before. I'd like to give more time for our audience. I was told by the organizer we will be finishing at 5:35, so we will basically have 30 minutes for Q&A. So the floor is open. I would like to collect 3 questions in a row and then give it to our panelists. A question over there.
Thank you very much. I'm Hosoda from Japan, but I teach at the Charles University in Prague, in the Czech Republic. And thank you very much. The quite nice and prepared explanation of the individual countries' standpoint. I would like to ask you, the all panels, and including the Dr. Han, more and more the major powers start and involve and comment to the South China Sea issues. More and more, I think more and more, we need some kind of rule or norm or mechanism to prevent unexpected crash or escalation of the collision to the military crash. So in this sense, I would like to ask you your personal opinion and also your government opinion or idea, if you have, how to regulate these kind of, and how to prevent this kind of military unexpected military crash. Thank you.
So near I said, if I missed any of you, raise your hand a bit higher. Professor Taylor, please.
Carl Thayer, I'd like to ask both Patrick Cronin and Chris Roberts to respond to each other. We had a rather upbeat presentation by Patrick about U.S. policies, but to implement it, it's got to work with allies. But one of the foremost allies in the region, other than Japan, is Australia, and yet we heard some demurring about aspects of the policy. So I'd like to have each one respond to the remarks of the other.
Maybe I should invite Professor Cronin to answer Professor Taylor's question, and then give everyone a floor to respond to Japanese scholars' question about military clash.
Well, Carl, I appreciate the question. You know, I was just in Australia having a great dialogue. I'll be there again next month. And I think the extent of the dialogue, both officially and unofficially, between Washington and Canberra, and between the US and Australia, is extraordinarily tight. And so that despite the disputes one reads about in newspapers, I've never seen this relationship any closer than it is at present. So yes, there are differences, but it's also working on the same common sort of strategy. I was very privileged to be facilitating the dialogue among chiefs of defense for all Indo-Asia Pacific for Admiral Davidson. a couple months ago, and I can tell you the Australian-US role there was extraordinary in terms of behind the scenes. Similarly, in Newport, Rhode Island, with the Chiefs of Naval Operations, where I was also speaking for the global chiefs, the U.S.-Australian relationship was very tight. So I'm sorry if I didn't get to see the slides that Christopher was showing, because I was sitting here. Maybe it would have been more obvious. Well, that was just the time down there. Those were not slides. And I didn't really see. But if you want to bring up a problem with U.S. policy, I'll be happy to try to give you my interpretation. I guess what I'm trying to say with my upbeat view about U.S. policy on Asia is that it's not all that you hear from the top messenger-in-chief. The actual policy of the people working on foreign and security and development policy in the United States government, the incredible men and women who are trying to produce a coherent, rational, intelligent, long-term policy, is really not that changed and not that different under this administration. It's evolutionary. And in fact, it goes to the other point, for instance, about thinking about mechanisms for how do you avoid a crisis. And if I just pivot to that question very briefly, because the last administration signed 2 memoranda of understanding to try to avoid incidents in the air and at sea. The United States has worked multilaterally with the CUES process to try to extend it to Coast Guards as well, voluntarily code of conduct essentially. And the United States, I think, is open to something like an incidents at sea agreement with the Chinese, because there's a need, especially when you start thinking about hypersonic weapons, there's an ever-growing need, frankly, in cyberspace and outer space being global areas of competition that could affect the South China Sea. Just because they're not centered on the South China Sea, they could affect an incident here. There's a growing need for that kind of mechanism in the U.S.-China context, but also between, frankly, Japan and China and other countries as well. Anyway, I'm sorry if I didn't take the bait here. I'm not sure what the beef is with Australia.
I take Patrick Cronin's point in terms of there's much more to the Australia-US relationship, partnership, friendship that goes back so long in time than a single administration, a single leader. The connections still run deep, and at the ground level, there's so much happening between, at the Foreign Affairs, Department of State level, US, Australian military level, etc. But with any friendship, there's always going to be points of differences, such as the phone ops, etc. But nonetheless, the statements that I quoted, for example, are coming from the Australian Foreign Minister, the Australian Prime Minister. This is deliberate signalling to the US about Australian concerns regarding the nature of engagement, and in many ways there are still strong points of engagement, but there are also other aspects that are deeply lacking. So I think there's probably room for perhaps much more dialogue between Australia and the US, but also between the US and other key countries across the region to develop a better understanding about some of these concerns. Because at the moment, and I think it's not just Australia, I've heard senior officials here in Vietnam, in Taiwan, and in other countries talk about the problem with this kind of, what's the word, transactionalist approach, or perceived transactionalist approach under President Trump is history, values, etc. There's a feeling that these might be sacrificed, over a deal over North Korea or some other issue. And rightly or wrongly, that's a perspective that I think is informing to varying degrees perspectives in the region. But importantly, again, maybe some of the operational caution we're seeing coming out of Australia. Critically, the quote about US exceptionalism, revisionism in terms of unilateral withdrawals from treaty obligations, that perhaps undermines the moral authority of Australia to then comment on maybe what Australia believes is the exceptionalism, unilateral breach of international law by China. So this is hence where I began, the tale of two cities, in a way. That what Australia would love to see is that all countries support a rules-based order, and I think many other countries in the region would like to see that, and that includes that when we sign a treaty, when we ratify a treaty, that we adhere by the obligations that link to that treaty. But again, I'd like to highlight the Australia-US relationship is our closest partnership. It will remain so, but now is just a somewhat challenging time at a certain level in terms of unpredictability or perceived unpredictability with Trump. Thank you.
I want to respond to a question from the Japanese scholar.
Thank you for the question. And, I think we need to separate into three terms to consider. In the short term, it is difficult to stop China from behaving like that. So if China does not have idea to discuss the issue with the countries without Southeast Asian region, then we need to show our intention by forces, I think. China is always excluding the Japan and the United States and other countries from the discussion because those countries are out of region. Of course, China and ASEAN countries establishing the code of conduct, it will help to avoid the military confrontation in South China Sea. But freedom of navigation is not only for the those countries. We need to concern with the freedom of navigation issues, not only in South China Sea, but also other oceans, I think. And in the middle term, we need to consider how to change the structure or image of the US-China confrontation. So as I mentioned, the Southeast Asian region must be the third actor in the economic cooperation. President Trump has the concern, interested in the economic benefit. And Chinese purpose is also the economic development. A fundamental purpose of the Chinese leadership is the long-term stable rule by the Communist Party over the China mainland. But they need to develop its economy for the stable society inside of China. We other countries, I think we can agree to develop our own economy. Then we can establish the network. It's not official, but not institutional. But the economic network can be the base of the security framework, I think. Now, long term, we may need to consider the international system itself. Thank you.
Ideas on US for new mechanisms or new ideas to prevent a military clash from happening. I would argue not in the sense of someone from Europe trying partners, friends in Asia, what to do and what not to do, but simply to present some humble ideas on this, that I think a reframing of the narrative on the South China Sea is in order to prevent such a clash from happening, away from positions, from a zero-sum logic, from balancing and counterbalancing vis-à-vis each other, and towards to management, not resolution. I don't think for the time being those conflicts are resolvable. This is my personal opinion. This is, again, not the opinion or view of the German government or the EU for that matter. But from my personal view as an analyst, as a researcher, I don't see any conflict resolution in the legal sense or political sense for the foreseeable future. What I see, though, are new avenues or different avenues for conflict management. One has already been mentioned, which I would also like to highlight by my esteemed colleague Stein Tonneson from Norway, the dilemma of the commons. Fish. Fish don't care about EEZs, but they don't care about delimitations and so on and so forth, but they are for the food and economic security of all the littoral states, very much so for China, but very much so also for all other littoral states of the South China Sea, utterly crucial. And fish stocks are absolutely depleted in the South China Sea. There's no absolute hard data on this, but the estimates have already been mentioned by Stein this morning. Between 70 to 80% is the estimate, is gone. So if you look at the UN prediction, by 2030 to 2040, there will be no more. There will be no more significant resources of fish in the South China Sea. It's the most overfished sea in the world. So the dilemma of the commons is how I would approach it, in the sense that you could build on joint fisheries cooperation. You could think about maritime peace parks. There are a lot of ideas out there to reframe the conflict from a zero-sum logic to a thinking about this is a dilemma of the commons, and we all have an equal, sort of, in a way, equal stake in this. This is not to mean to compromise on international law, the rule of law, etc. pp. This is merely as a way to better manage the conflict for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Coming from Russia, I'm a pessimist about most things, and particularly about I would agree here about the resolution. And I think that, the approach would be to start small, and would be, of course, to focus on unplanned encounters, on unintended crisis. This is actually a thing where, for example, Russia and the United States were relatively successful in managing, especially with the long history we have when we had all sorts of arrangements of managing unplanned encounters and unintended clashes, which I think is always a good idea, because I think we sometimes focus too much on the big things and on the, I would even go as far as to go that reframing the issue from a zero-sum to a win-win situation. We're really far from that, I would think, because that sounds like a mental paradigm shift. And I mean, that is not something that will happen in the next 10, 15 or 20 years with the elites in power right now in most countries. So another thing we could do is keep, as maybe sounding more idealist than I should, keeping multilateralism alive, even if it just means socializing each other and just, seeing each other more often. And of course, another thing that I think, since we're discussing great powers here and external powers, right? The thing that external powers can do is to put their diplomatic weight behind arrangements where countries that exert behavior of certain assertiveness would suffer the moral or reputational consequences. I think that is important. That is something that we can do. I think that is something that Europe is particularly good at, or at least seeks to be good at, the normative component of that. So I think that that is a responsibility of external powers to at least do that and demonstrate and impose reputational costs on those who escalate.
As a chair, I think I have to refrain from answering your question in a very comprehensive way. So to be very brief, I don't see the future or possibility of military clash in the South China Sea between China and ASEAN. And we have very good mature mechanism like CUES, and to make sure everything on the right track between China and US. We also have a lot of MOU on encounter a sea on airspace, we have a lot of like mechanisms to manage it well. So if you don't have any question, I would like to invite our speakers to, anyone? Please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you for all the panelists. I think we have to accept that the two biggest elephant in the room is definitely US and China, whether you want to say anything else. And I appreciate the inclusion of Japan, European Unions, and our friend from Russia. It is very reassuring to hear Dr. Patrick your view about America is not here in the region to contain China. You make a case. But I must say that throughout conferences I went, you are quite minority, a minority American. The Americans see China differently than what you said, but I can really appreciate what you tried to tell us, that cooperation is better. Although you did mention your 4 points about the rule of law, the sustainable development, inclusive diplomacies, and also security cooperations. And you did mention that America wished to see a strong and binding COC in the South China Sea. This is precisely what I don't believe China wanted. So let me ask the question to all of the panel, whether you see China is too strong or strong enough to change the international norm or international order, or that you see that China is not strong enough yet and want to just play by the rule that has been established over many years now. Because the debate of China rise now is that when it's rise, it may change this order that we all know. Do you see that? And everyone can share their perspectives. Thank you very much.
And there is a question over there.
Hi, my name is Do Thanh Hai from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. I know that we are running out of time, but I would like to thank you for your insights and also very comprehensive presentation on the topic. I have very short questions, and I saw that you all expressed that the major powers of the world all have the interest in the South China Sea, and so I'm wondering with that whether you have any red line, in the South China Sea for any type of actions, and why, is there any red lines, so why that red line is important for every country in the region? Yeah, thank you.
I'm gonna give the last question to the lady over there.
Okay. I hope this works and you can hear me. I'm Anke, I work for the Belgian Embassy. I have a very short question for Mr. Heiduk. You're talking about resources and more specifically about fish. Do you think there is a role for the European Union to give, as you said, we're not like the hard power, but more like delivering technical assistance. But when speaking about the fish, we have a common fishery policy which has been dating back to a long time ago, and which is actually all based on scientific research in our seas. There is an institute, I think it's in Denmark, that before we assign the quotas to all the European countries, counts the fish and makes establishments of what the situation is. Do you think, like this technical experience, that this could be a role we could play, and that, more importantly, politically speaking, we have the trust of all the parties involved to play this kind of role?
That's the persistent over there, so make sure this is our last question.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mian from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. From my point of view, like in my personal view, I think that the U.S. have like stronger like actions in the South China Sea towards China. For example, they have more numbers of phone-offs as well, the natural bit. for the first time, like have a phone over Scarborough, as well as like, I'm just have a question for Dr. Patrick Cronin. That do you think that it is a solely a response of the U.S. towards China because of this action, like increasing like militarization in the South China Sea, or is like part of a bigger picture? I mean, there like strategic like competition between the U.S. and China. Thank you.
I think I'm going to reverse the order and asking Anton to respond first, and then.
Sure, thank you. I'll try to be short and address most importantly Ambassador Tsvetov's question about China and the world order. I think not to be too transactional, but I think we have to try and be at least instrumental about this. Bless you. I think that China has mostly been a beneficiary of the world order as it used to be, or as it still is, I think, as most countries have been. And the fact that we seem to see actions on behalf of China that we think do not fit into how we would act in such an order doesn't necessarily mean that China is willing or ready to overturn the whole system. I think that what it does mean is that an adjustment is in the waiting, and that we should try and understand what sort of adjustment would China be comfortable with, and try to see whether we can move towards these adjustments or not. I hope this is not too vague. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to tackle the question on fish and the EU's role. Technical experience, yeah, sure. There are all sorts of possibilities, I think, for transfer of ideas and best practices, experiences from the EU and its member states, which have, as you rightly alluded to, decades now of experience with set quotas, etc. Might be too technical for this part of the world. But this is not for me to say and not for the EU to say. I think the EU and its member states can make offers, and if those are welcomed by partners in the region, then all the better for it. And I know that especially at track 2 level, the level I usually operate with, there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of debate already, at least within ASEAN, on the matter. So I do see interest in the region, and I would say, with regards to your second question or your sub-question, what about the trust of all parties? Well, mind you, if parties around the South China Sea, I'm going to put it very bluntly for the sake of discussion, you could argue do not get their act together soon, the whole question of fish and fish stocks will be irrelevant because there will be none. So I'm not sure if it's really essentially a question about trust, but it's essentially, I think the way I envision it, at one point there'll be so much pressure to act on the dwindling fish stocks to prevent the tragedy of the commons. The China question, I think you probably better ask. My quick answer or half answer would be, depends on which part of the international order we speak about. I mean, if you were to talk to people in my home country, in Germany, about the WTO as part of the international order, a lot of people would say it definitely needs reforming. Whether that's necessarily a reform in line with China's policy preferences, probably not entirely, but I think there are even some shared policy preferences regarding WTO reform between various quote-unquote Western countries and China. So it depends on what sort of part of the international order we speak about when we talk about reform and change. Just to make this clear, I'm not advocating any complete overthrow of it or anything like that. However, I would argue I see for some parts of it at least definitely need for reform, and that's something I think where one could certainly cooperate with many other states in Asia and beyond. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for the question. The question shows us still the United States and China are the player of the game in the South China Sea. As for the ambassador's question, I do not believe China is enough strong to change the international norms, orders now. But Chinese leadership, President Xi Jinping has already declared that China will support establish a new type of international relations with the core of fair and win-win. And he also said the present international relations is full of unfair. They said it in the speech on the military parade held on the September 3rd, 2015. And he also stated same thing in the 2013. So it is the Chinese perception to the international orders, norms, rules. So it shows the China would try to change the norms, orders in the future. So China is trying to get support from developing countries by the economic aid, investment. It is also the problem. It must be the part of diplomatic strategy. Chinese scholars always said China does not have idea to change the entire international world order or international rules, but China has right to change the part of the international rules. So I think it is the Chinese perception. China want to change a part of international norms, so China is trying to build up its own capability to which can refuse the interference from the outside country.
Thank you. Just responding to Hai's question, I think maybe one red line that comes to mind that probably is broadly held would be if there was a military attack by one claimant against another, and that was unprovoked. But nonetheless, in terms of Canberra's position, I guess when I think about this, it's hard to think of really what the current policy is and what the red lines are, and that's unfortunate. And I think that needs to be articulated and better addressed beyond, say, some broader statements in the Defence White Paper and Australian Foreign Policy White Paper. So we need a longer-term focus on this issue in the broader region, and our position needs to be values-based as well. So that's, I talked about the issues with or certain concerns with the President Trump administration, but also my concern with the Australian government under the current, all sides of politics really, is that we're not really demonstrating a sufficiently values-based approach to the regional order, certainly not consistently so. In terms of where Australia sits in terms of China and how powerful it should or could be, Australia has historically over the decades, I think, been a very good friend to China and vice versa. So there's in principle no issue with how big or how powerful China could be. The only, I guess the key wish would be that a powerful China, and to whatever level that may rise to, is stable and peaceful, and works with other countries on an equal basis. And we would hope, of course, that continue to consolidate internally in terms of the domestic stability there. And likewise to reinforce, of the immigrants from Asia, the longest term Asian immigrants in Australia are the Chinese with the gold rushes in the 1800s, etc. And the Chinese have and continue to make enormous contributions in Australia. Our concern is simply with the policies of the government in China. Thank you.
So, Dr. Cronin, as one of the two big elephants in the room, you have the final word.
Well, thank you very much. This is an example of China-U.S. cooperation in action. Very briefly, the concern the United States has in general about China is not about Chinese power. Yes, that is an issue and it plays into psychology, but the real issue is a question of behavior. And so we heard this morning when we heard the theory, the nice theory, that China was simply trying to balance stability and rights in the South China Sea. And we heard Carl Thayer's excellent pointed 3 questions or with answers, suggesting that maybe that's not all China's been trying to do. Maybe there's another dimension of Chinese policy that wasn't really fully fitting into that nice theory this morning. The concern is when China wants to project its domestic power and law onto others is a concern. And what's happening in Xinjiang, for instance, right now, in the way the Chinese government had trouble even talking about it, even confessing to what was really happening, makes the United States worried about how China will behave elsewhere. Anytime, this goes back to the question of red lines. I mean, anytime an independent sovereign power is forced into submission, into accepting another power's rules or acquiescing in some other way, the international community is somewhat weaker and diminished by that. Now, the United States is not perfect, obviously, on this. Historically, we're all guilty of some of this. But the point is, what kind of a future do we want to build together? And I think the United States should be and can be committed to that kind of future with Southeast Asia. So red lines are a difficult thing to talk about because you don't want to lock in officials with future what-if questions. What happens if? But clearly, there's a hierarchy. If there's a use of force against another sovereign actor in the world, that's going to trigger some kind of response. Whether it triggers, just a military response, well, it depends on the circumstances, but it could. Even major acts of coercion could. I think from the U.S. perspective, we want to make sure that our partners like Vietnam and our allies like the Philippines do not face that kind of threat, because we want to back it up. We want to provide that kind of assurance that you should be able to be a sovereign, independent nation and protect your interests and rights and sovereignty. I think there should be a tighter Article 4 commitment to the Philippines, frankly, which is the equivalent of Article 5 to Japan. But I can't speak for the U.S. government. I can just tell you my personal view on this, and it goes back then to the question about Scarborough Shoal, how much of this is sort of larger competition with China, how much of it is specific to Scarborough Shoal or the Philippines or the South China Sea. It's a good question. It's difficult to answer because it's complicated. Both are a factor. But the United States, if it's about larger competition with China, we have other ways to respond to that kind of competition. If it's about Scarborough Shoal and suddenly it's being reclaimed or there's shooting there, then I think the United States will need to respond on the scene in the region. And it will not be acceptable and it won't be sufficient for the United States simply to respond with some sanction. There's going to have to be something more direct. So it's both is the answer to that, but you're asking a what-if question. Right now, we have peace, and we want to preserve the peace. We want to deter aggression and adventurism. We want to preserve a rule set. We want to adapt the rules. The rules are not permanent. The rules evolve, but let's evolve them together. Let's not have them arbitrarily changed by one power because it's suddenly bigger and decided that, hey, you know what, we've had these claims forever. Why don't we now impose them? Well, we're going to have to figure this out together peacefully, and with reasonable scholars, we can do that. With other authorities, it can be more complicated, and it triggers other responses. So I'll end on that more positive note here.
Thank you. That brings to a successful end of this session. So I'd like to welcome everyone to join me giving a very big applause to all 5 panelists. Thank you very much for contributing.